Hi everyone, and welcome to my professional development on adolescent literacy. I've decided to title this training as The Secret Identities of Adolescents because, as you'll see, much of what we discuss today will center around the theme of adolescents and their processes of finding their identities. Since we will be discussing the topic of identity at length, I thought it would only be right to begin by sharing my own with you. So this is me in a nutshell. My name is Ashley Gaska. I live in Tampa, Florida, where I've lived for most of my life. My housemates are my husband, my 2 dogs, and my 2 cats. Besides my love of animals, I have many other great passions in life: painting, drawing, writing, reading, teaching, learning, music, and more. These passions, as well as my values, priorities, memories, and experiences, are all part of what make me who I am. These pieces come together to inform how I interact with the world around me. So now that I've introduced myself properly, I would like you to take a moment and reflect on how you identify. Use the markers and paper at your table to either jot down or draw the things that make you who you are. Feel free to list as many as possible. Take about 5 minutes to do this. Here I would put on a 5-minute timer on my phone. Now, I would like you to take another 3 minutes to share what you wrote with the person across from you. I would pause again and put another timer on my phone. Based on what you included as part of your identity and what your neighbors included, I'm sure you're beginning to see several patterns emerge about identity. One you might have noticed is that identity is incredibly personal and nuanced. Some people may feel that their identity is shaped by their upbringing, neighborhood, family, or culture. Others may resonate strongly with their religion or lack of religious affiliation. Others yet may gravitate toward personality traits that they would use to define themselves. Some might choose their passions or hobbies, like I did. The truth is, each of us are a sum of a million little parts that make us who we are. What I would like to propose here today is that our literacy and literacy experiences make up some of those parts. We will touch more on the topic of identity later, but first, let's go over what we will be covering today. These are the topics we will discuss during this session: our mission objectives, an overview of adolescent literacy, the importance and shaping of adolescent literacy, environmental and cultural factors of identity, strategies for engaging and teaching adolescents, helping students find themselves in literature, helping students find their voices in literacy, developing disciplinary literacy, and our next actions. Of course, I'm providing my sources at the end as well for any of you who may wish to learn about the subject further through some light reading. So, here is our mission for today, should we choose to accept it, and hopefully we shall. By the end of this training, we should be able to identify why identity is so important to adolescents and what contributes to how it is shaped, including the sociocultural and environmental factors that play a role. We should be able to use strategies that incorporate a multitude of text types and literacy options to engage a variety of learners, plan instruction designed to allow students to find their voices while engaging in literacy tasks, and understand the impact of disciplinary literacy and how we could help students develop it. For a moment, I want you to think about your own definition of literacy. Take a few moments and jot down your response. What is your definition of literacy? What are your standards of literacy? Meaning, what would you have to observe to consider a person literate? Here I would pause for a moment until I see that people look satisfied with what they've written. Now that you've had the opportunity to think about your own definition of literacy, let's look at how the International Literacy Association defines it. Literacy is defined as the ability to identify, understand, interpret, create, compute, and communicate using visual, audible, and digital materials across disciplines and in any context. One thing I want you to notice is that this definition goes beyond the traditional studies of reading and writing print-based information. That's an important facet of understanding adolescent literacy, which we will talk more about in length in a bit. Looking back at your definition, did it encompass the general points as this one from the ILA? Or did it focus on print-based texts? As teachers in the 21st century, we need to challenge our preconceptions of literacy and open our minds to what literacy has evolved into. Speaking of opening our minds, let's take a moment to open up the adolescent mind. How do adolescents think and learn? What processes are their brains undergoing through this sometimes turbulent period of development? According to a TED Talk by Sarah Jane Blakemore entitled The Mysterious Workings of the Adolescent Brain, there are several things we have come to understand about the adolescent brain thanks to modern neuroscience. The most important change is that during adolescence, the prefrontal cortex undergoes significant development. For those of you like myself who are not neuroscientists or neurologists, the prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain responsible for some of our most commonly used functions, such as decision-making, impulse inhibition, problem-solving, social behavior, and more. While it is still underdeveloped in the adolescent years, as you might imagine, these processes are not as strong as you would see in adults. That is why teenagers are known for making more impulse decisions without thinking of long-term consequences. Another process taking place during adolescence is one known as synaptic pruning, which describes the process of the brain eliminating synapses that no longer serve the individual and strengthening the ones that do. Synapses are the physical electric connections that neurons make when we really learn something. During the process of synaptic pruning, though, the brain is culling the material it deems useless to the body and strengthening the material that it uses regularly. This process is entirely dependent on the individual's environment. It makes sense if you think about it. In an environment where you must do task A regularly, whether for survival or other purposes, task A grows stronger. However, if you almost never do task B will become weaker and weaker until it is eliminated entirely. So, pop quiz. Who here can tell me how to calculate the volume of a cone? What about the surface area? I'm just kidding, don't answer that. My point is, the phrase use it or lose it has some real truth to it. As teachers, we have to consider the skills and information that we identify as vital to our students' success and determine how to fit it into their environment in a way that serves them and strengthens their synaptic connections to it. The last process of the prefrontal cortex for us to consider for our purposes today is that of adolescent perspective. While the prefrontal cortex is in flux, the individual finds it difficult to consider alternative perspectives without direct cues to do so. This is why sometimes it might seem like teenagers consider themselves the center of the universe. So, for the next 2 minutes, I would like you to turn and talk with your table partners about this question. What are some of the implications you can see or imagine based on this understanding of adolescent brain development? Here I pause and allow people to talk to each other. Now that we know a little more about the brain, let's revisit what I mentioned before about the multimodalities of literacy. As you know, literacy isn't just reading and writing, and thus literacy should not be centered only around print-based texts. That doesn't mean we should rush to burn our novels and poetry in a bonfire, just that we should make room in our instruction for other forms of epistemology. First, let's think of learning from visual sources. This may refer to video resources, images, graphic novels, comic books, and even video games, though that one would also fall under a text source as well. Off the top of my head, here are several literacy tasks that can be applied to visual texts: evaluating for credibility, identifying purposes and biases, analyzing rhetorical appeals and logical fallacies, synthesizing information, identifying nuances, and analyzing directorial decisions. And as we move along and look through other sources of learning and literacy practice, social media, the internet, and audio, just to name a few, we can see that there are many applicable high-level literacy skills: evaluating, synthesizing, gathering information and interpreting it, organizing and carrying out projects, and so on. Benjamin Bloom would be blooming with excitement, if you can pardon my pun. In Reconceptualizing the Literacies in Adolescents' Lives by Donna E. Alverman and Kathleen A. Hinchman, the authors acknowledge that literate competence is defined almost exclusively by national, state, and local standards related to processing print. Adolescents are developing new competencies as they increasingly use and create a range of electronic print and media texts. They go on to say that multimediating involves not only a simultaneous allocation of attention to different tasks, it also involves multimodal channel switching and/or simultaneous channel use plus rapid attention shifts, some self-initiated, some as automatic responses to a media field. In other words, adolescents are developing a type of processing flexibility as well as methods of existing and interacting with the world that the authors consider a brain upgrade of sorts. Not only does multimediating and technoliteracy promote this cognitive flexibility, but more importantly, it engages hard-to-reach learners in complex thinking tasks in ways that traditional approaches do not. This isn't to say that print-based sources need to be abandoned completely. Look, all my life I fantasized about owning the library from the Beauty and the Beast, so it's safe to say I'm not advocating for tossing away the process of studying literature. What I'm suggesting is using multiple types of literacies to develop the skills and mental abilities students need to access literature with the same complexity. Now, you may be wondering how identity plays a role in all of this. Well, remember only a few moments ago how I mentioned student engagement and motivation? Well, according to Alverman and Hinchman, our engagements with everyday texts help all readers and writers to shape and reshape their identities. But adolescents in particular engage in more fluid, intentional, and often passionate identity play in their encounters with such symbolic resources. In other words, as students engage with text, they often imagine themselves in the roles of the characters, trying on their identities, living their experiences, laughing at their jokes, crying at their pain. I'm sure we can all relate to the feelings of indignity when someone slights our favorite character, or the feeling of triumph when they finally succeed at reaching their goal, or the feeling of heartbreak as they fall just short of it. Adolescence is a time for exploring one's identity. And as teachers, we are part of our students' environments, and as such, we can guide and shape their identity-forming process. Before we could do so, though, we need to facilitate cultures of trust and respect, primarily through understanding and respecting students' identities. Besides building trust, it can also help us pair them with texts that they will find meaningful and memorable. We are about to read some excerpts from a survey of 2 students at 2 different points in their lives. Before we do that, though, I want to remind you that we do not completely transform as we turn into adults. Adolescents are already in the process of becoming who they're going to be. So, let's take a look at these excerpts of 2 teenagers, Eleanor and David. Group 1 will read about Eleanor, while Group 2 will take on David. While you read the adolescent summaries, underline anything that indicates aspects of who they are in terms of interests, experiences, or how they see themselves. Then read the adult summaries of them. Determine which of their interests from their teen years carried on into their adult lives 8 years later. How did their identities evolve over time? Here I would pause and allow people to read the excerpts. If you're still wondering why identity matters so much to teens, here are a few reasons why. When teens understand their own identities, they can relate to others with similar shared identities. Sometimes this can help them transcend other aspects of their identity that might be considered barriers. This made me think recently of something my husband mentioned to me. Like a lot of guys, he loves cars. Recently, he told me that one thing he loved about car events was that you see so many different types of people at the events. You see people of every race, religion, sexuality, background, and so on. But none of that matters when you all share the love of the automobile. At a car show, a typical southern redneck can jump into an impassioned discussion with a Pakistani immigrant about his admiration for the work he's done on his vehicle. As you can see from this anecdote, shared interests or shared identities can bring together people who may not have otherwise interacted or had the chance to interact. As you can infer from the previous scenario, teens or adults can also develop empathy for others unlike themselves when they focus on the things they have in common rather than their differences. Recently, I saw the movie Turning Red and loved it. Shortly after, I read an article from a white man about how the movie was alienating unless you were an Asian kid growing up in Toronto. I completely disagreed. Even as a white kid growing up a long way from Canada, I saw so much of myself in Maymay and her experiences. Sure, I didn't have to help my family with their business, and I never turned into an animal, unfortunately. But surely we could all remember going through the awkward growing pains of adolescence and the way every event felt world-ending. When teens see themselves in people who look different than them or who are from different cultures or have different circumstances, they learn that those people might not be as different as they originally believed. They learn to focus on the things they do have in common rather than the things they don't. Getting back to the more teachery aspects, as teens are in the process of finding themselves, they feel specifically motivated by literacy assignments that help them explore who they are and who they want to be. If you don't believe me, set up your most unmotivated student with a personality test, and that might be the first assignment they turn in all year. Adolescents want to know more about who they are, especially because it can feel so foggy at times. Additionally, they want to share their identities with others as a way to feel seen at a time when so many feel judged. This is especially true of historically silenced and stereotyped groups. Kelly Wisman and Lilitha Vasudevan, a la Alverman and Hinchman, present several instances of urban youth engaging in literacy tasks, such as autobiographical explorations and collective meaning-making through the arts and literacies. Particularly powerful was the expression that they were both drawn to a re-envisioning of educational spaces with urban adolescents as a practice of freedom that connects the will to know with the will to become. We also see this urge to clarify in the poem High School Training Ground by Malcolm London, where he defines himself as an honors that goes home with the regulars, and his high school as a place that sorts honors from regulars and a recurring cycle to recycle the trash from the system. While at school, he is seen as an exemplary student. He also shares the same background with many students who are already dismissed by their society. Finally, when teens understand their identity, they can more easily choose stories that will be more memorable and meaningful, creating their own literacy histories. According to Alfred W. Tatum via Hinchman and Sheridan Thomas in Best Practices in Adolescent Literacy Instruction, engaging students with texts by honoring their multiple identities has been a focus of adolescent literacy for more than 2 decades. Later, Tatum takes interest in textual lineage by asking students which stories they have read that they will remember for their entire lives. He remarks, the students' comments suggest that texts will move them to feel differently about themselves, affect their views of themselves, or move them to some action in their current time and space are the ones they remember or find meaningful. What Tatum is describing here is the process of students finding themselves through their engagement with texts. I hope by this point you can understand why identity is so important to adolescents and why it should be important to teachers who wish to reach their adolescent students. With that in mind, let's shift focus a little to one aspect that contributes significantly to our environment, which are the sociocultural and environmental factors that surround us throughout our development. Take a look at your paper where you described your own identity. Circle any part that has to do with the location of your upbringing, race, religion, language, class, or anything else that you see as relating to your culture. I'll give you a few moments. Looking at my list, some of the things I chose to pinpoint about myself were that I was a lifelong Tampanian, Southerner, Floridian, a little city, and a little country. In fact, the only things about my identity that didn't directly relate to my culture were my hobbies and the fact that I like animals. You may think your culture doesn't play a big role in your identity, or you may understand the truth, which is that it absolutely does. It's a basic matter of biology that animals adapt to the environment where they live, and that includes so many facets that make us who we are. One example is our shared language. Since I was raised in Tampa by white parents, I grew up speaking only English in my household. That's cultural. Since my parents were Southerners and Florida is a southern state, I'm comfortable using words like y'all, and I understand when people say things like over yonder. I can easily decipher, imitate, and understand thick southern accents. My experiences, culture, and history inform so many of my decisions on a day-to-day basis, and I guarantee that yours does as well. This aspect of my culture I just mentioned, language, is an important topic to consider when teaching adolescents, especially those who speak in languages and dialects other than standard American English. In reconceptualizing the literacies in adolescents' lives, one parent says, "English has a way of degrading you. Talkin' is supposed to feel natural. I feel angry. I'm angry about this. This deals with my self-esteem. They always tell us we're shiftless, we're lazy. I passed Eng 101 class at junior college, but the teacher flunked me and wrote on my last paper that it was because I talked funny. English is a weapon of oppression, just another tool to keep me in my place, even if I master the language," and he trails off. As teachers and hopefully lovers of English and language in general, we need to use English as a tool of empowerment, not of oppression. We also need to honor other forms of English and other languages that shape students' identities. While we do need to help students learn when and how to code switch to standard English for their future success, that should never come at the cost of invalidating their natural mode of communication, nor should that mode be used to make them feel inferior. This especially needs to be said of those who would disparage others who use AAVE, or African American Vernacular English, who have traditionally been seen as uneducated, even though AAVE is a specific dialect with its own set of grammar rules, its own complexity, and nuances. There is nothing uneducated about AAVE, it is simply another way to communicate. Language is just one facet of sociocultural factors that shape our identities. We also need to consider how sociocultural factors affect what our students value and prioritize in their lives, as well as what they find relatable. With that being said, be careful not to stereotype students based on anything observable about them. Instead, ask them about themselves, get to know them, and let them share facets of their unique cultures with you. How do you do that? Well, that leads us to our next topic. How do we shift our practices to teach adolescents and meet their needs? First, I want to show you the poem I mentioned before, High School Training Ground by Malcolm London. While you watch, pay attention to the various ways he talks about his experiences, his relationship with school, the impact of his environment and society on how he sees himself. Here I would play the video. Then I would ask, does anyone have reflections about the video that they would like to share? Thoughts? Ideas? For me, I felt like the way Malcolm speaks here is so powerful, from his diction to his intentional tone, the words he emphasizes, and the message he communicates. It's easy to see that he finds it empowering to have a voice and speak about what it means to attend public school in his neighborhood of Chicago. Thus, as far as teaching strategies go, I want to start by talking about the way we can help students find their own voices. Well, the first thing that we need to do is embrace a shift in our own thinking, like I mentioned earlier. Not only do we need to incorporate multiple types of literacy, though, but we also need to understand that not all writing needs to be driven by pursuit of academia. If a student posts a paragraph about their thoughts on a current event on their social media page, is that not writing? Are they not reflecting on something they learned about, processing their ideas, and responding based on their knowledge? If a student makes a video for their TikTok where they talk about something they learned and their thoughts about it, is that not engaging in literacy? They are reflecting on their learning and creating content after mentally computing their thoughts. If a student reads a book and writes their own fan fiction where they accurately emulate the author's style, the characters' voices and behaviors, and the context of the character's settings, while bringing out a brand new story that follows the elements of plot and uses diction and tone to build suspense and tension, how is that not academic enough for school? As you could see, the world of literacy and knowledge go far beyond paper and pencil, and we should see that as a wonderful thing that opens up a world of opportunities for both students and teachers. With that being said, here are strategies that teachers can use as well as their benefits to students. 1, while I understand that most of us are control freaks, myself included, sometimes we need to loosen the reins and give students choices. For example, instead of requiring students to all read the same novel that students have been reading for the last 50 years, allow them to choose from a batch of pre-selected appropriate novels. You still have the ability to assess for rigor, content, and theme beforehand, as well as prepare related projects around them, but students have a little more choice about which story would interest them the most. You could give them even more choice and allow them to use the internet to explore books on a certain topic or theme that you want them to learn about and choose 1 or 2 that are the most appealing to them. For example, if your class is studying the Holocaust, there are so many books students can choose from. It's also a great idea for helping students choose books that are within their zones of proximal development through websites such as Lexile.com. Another aspect of choice is giving students a choice board for their projects to be able to decide the way they want to relate to the texts. Try to think of as many types of media as possible for them to choose from and offer suggestions, but also be open to ideas from the students as well. For example, I recently read an article called Because We Have Lived It, Chicanx, Latinx, Youth Multimodal Literacies, and Youth Participatory Action Research by Monica Gonzalez Ibarra. In that article, students collected testimonials from their community and put their data into a table and analyzed their data to identify common themes. Gonzalez Ibarra also encouraged the students to consider how their unique perspectives contributed to their own understanding of their findings, compared to if someone else had done the same project. By doing so, the students are cued to considering other perspectives while also seeing the power of their own. Because they have lived it, as the title suggests, they have a unique perspective for their project. That being said, one of the great things about the project was that it took a lot of it was initiated by the students themselves. The students created their own research questions, took the initiative to collect the testimonials, organized and analyzed their data, and shared their findings through creative outlets. This process is part of the Youth Participatory Action Research model. The students engaged in complex activities at every stage and were motivated at least in part by the freedom they were allowed, but also from the teacher bringing importance to their identities and their community. This project told the students, your community matters, your voice matters, you deserve to be seen and heard. As you know, building a sense of community for students is vital to running a successful classroom that encourages mutual growth for everyone. However, students should also be encouraged to participate in communities beyond their classroom. Earlier, for instance, I mentioned fan fiction as a mode of responding to literature. With websites such as Wattpad, students can post their stories where others can read and comment on them. This can be something done among students in the classroom, where they add and comment on one another's stories, or it could be done publicly for students to share their work with anyone who wants to read it. If done in the classroom, this can be paired about instruction about how to offer constructive criticism. One thing I've learned is a technique called CCQ, Compliment, Critique, Question. The students read the stories of the others in their group and come up with 1 compliment, 1 critique, and 1 question. This can be a useful strategy in the earlier stages of the writing production process. The last strategy I want to share is that of student interest surveys. In Best Practices of Adolescent Literacy Instruction, Hinchman and Sheridan Thomas include this observation. curricular decisions continue to be made in high schools without the benefit of data about students' relationships with texts to govern these decisions for all students across ethnicities and achievement levels. One way that teachers can design their curriculum around students' relationship with texts is to find out what they're interested in reading about in the first place. How else can you access knowledge about student interests and their relationship with books if you don't ever ask them? As teachers, we should all be administering student interest surveys within the first week of school, as well as periodically throughout the year as our students' interests shift. So I hope you find some of these strategies helpful. Now I want to address one of the more complex issues within literacy, which is that of disciplinary literacy. Disciplinary literacy refers to the set of skills required for competent literacy within different areas of discipline. For example, to be literate in geometry, you need to understand words like prism, equilateral, and many other words. Disciplinary literacy requires background knowledge in the discipline in question. It requires students to understand context, access discipline-specific vocabulary, and use tools for acquiring knowledge in cases where they feel lacking. For teachers of English, reading, or language arts, this topic can feel a bit overwhelming. We ask ourselves, how are we supposed to incorporate instruction in all the different disciplines, while still trying to help students express their identities, read books relevant to their interests, and complete complex research projects? The short answer is, we're not, or at least not alone. All teachers should be teachers of reading. While we could never possibly give students every skill for every discipline by ourselves, what we can do is partner with teachers of other subjects and disciplines to help them learn how to instruct their students in literacy of their discipline, especially if they have no background in reading education themselves. We are getting to the end of our training, so I would like to offer some suggestions for our next actions. 1. Administer an interest survey if you haven't done so lately. 2. Book the computer lab and encourage students to explore online communities to develop their learning in relation to the world around them. And 3. Listen to your students when they tell you who they are. Seek to understand rather than to be understood. Here are my sources. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.